All right, today we are diving into a pretty startling claim from our source material. The idea that politics, all of it, at its very core, might be a form of spiritual betrayal. We're going to break down the theological argument that gets us to that really wild conclusion, one step at a time.
So, let's just put this central question right out there. Is supporting a political party a form of Satanism? Now, to be clear, we're not just throwing that out there for shock value. We're actually going to unpack the specific step-by-step logic from our source text that leads to this very place. It's a journey, for sure. It goes through ancient texts, spiritual contracts, you'll see.
Okay, so the entire argument, everything we're about to talk about, really hinges on this one core idea, a nation's spiritual contract. This concept, it's the foundation for everything that comes after. So the argument begins with this foundational claim that every single nation on earth is, when you get right down to it, headed by a spirit. Yeah, we're not talking about presidents or prime ministers or parliaments. The idea here is that a spiritual being is actually presiding over the nation as a spiritual entity.
And how are these spiritual nations even formed? Well, according to the text, it's all through something called a covenant. Now, what's really interesting here is the definition. It's not just a promise or a simple agreement. No, this is a binding spiritual agreement that, get this, literally creates the nation. It brings it into existence.
So how does this actually work? It sounds pretty abstract, right? Well, the source material doesn't just state this as a fact. It gives us what it calls the Abrahamic blueprint, what it sees as the divine model for how a nation is supposed to be formed correctly. And it all starts way back in the book of Genesis, with this promise from God to a man named Abraham. I will give you this land, and out of you shall I make a nation. According to the source, this is it. This is the divine spark that kicks off the whole nation-building process.
But Abraham's response, this is the absolute key. He doesn't just say, okay, great. He asks, how? How will you make me a nation? And this question, according to the source, is the prompt that makes God reveal the specific physical ritual for creating a nation.
And this is the ritual God lays out, and it is incredibly specific. You got to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram, plus some birds. But here's the crucial step, the part you can't miss. The larger animals are to be cut in half, with each piece laid opposite the other. It's a very physical, very graphic procedure.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? The source interprets this ritual as the universal template. The logic is that a nation is formed, literally, by cutting a covenant with a spirit. Abraham did it with God, and through that spiritual pact, he became a nation. Okay, but if that's the divine model, the source immediately gives us its dark reflection, the worldly alternative, a legacy it traces all the way back to the Tower of Babel and a guy named Nimrod.
The text claims that at Babel, Nimrod was actually trying to use the exact same spiritual technology to form a nation by cutting a covenant. But here's the critical difference, right? He was trying to make this pact with a spirit that was not God, and he was doing it all for his own glory.
And this slide just lays out the two competing models perfectly. On one side, you have the Abrahamic model, a covenant with God, all for God's promise. And on the other side, the Babel model, a covenant with some other spirit, all for man's ambition and glory. Two paths, same mechanism.
Now you might be asking, okay, where does this whole idea of other spirits ruling nations even come from? Well, the source points directly to this verse, Deuteronomy 32:8, and it specifically mentions the older manuscripts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. In those texts, it says, God set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. The source interprets sons of God here as a direct reference to these other spiritual beings.
And how many of these spiritual rulers were there? The source material really emphasizes the specific number, 70. The claim is that God delegated authority over the 70 nations of the ancient world to 70 of these sons of God.
And this is where it all comes together. The final section connects this whole ancient spiritual framework directly to our world, right now, and to the act of politics itself.
The argument here is that the Apostle Paul, when he wrote that our struggle is not against flesh and blood but against principalities and powers, well, he was talking about these same 70 spirits. In this view, our enemies aren't other people, they're the spiritual rulers of the nations. So, this leads to what the source sees as an unavoidable logical conclusion. If nations are ruled by these, let's call them fallen spirits, then to compete for leadership of that nation, to run for office, to be a politician,
is to willingly enter into a covenant with that nation's ruling spirit. So, what's the alternative then? What's the way out that's presented in the text? Well, it points to a totally different kind of citizenship. The argument is that your true identity isn't national, it's spiritual. Through faith, you become part of Abraham's seed, which makes you a member of God's single, spiritual nation, totally separate from all these worldly political structures.
And this is where the language gets incredibly strong. Therefore, the source claims that participating in or even just supporting these worldly political systems, which, remember, it argues are covenanted to other spirits, is a form of spiritual fornication. It's seen as cheating on your primary spiritual allegiance.
And this brings us to the source's final, unambiguous command. The text concludes with this direct quote, and it does not mince words, "End your support for politics, for this is spiritual fornication with Satanism." Wow, it just directly equates engaging with these political systems with Satanism itself.
Okay, we have just walked through a very complex and, let's be honest, a highly provocative theological argument. So we'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. If this spiritual framework were actually true, how would it fundamentally change the way we see the world?